So, guests and friends, it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. I'd like to remind you before we begin that our next guest on June the 27th will be Ambassador Robert Newman, who's now with the Georgetown School of International and Strategic Studies, and of course was formerly Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and Morocco. He'll be speaking on our longer range policy toward the Middle East, with the title, Is There Still a Chance for Peace in the Middle East? As you know, Ambassador Newman enjoys a very strong reputation, both for his service as an ambassador and also as a scholar. And we'd like to thank one of our anonymous corporate members for the reception this evening. Making our introduction is one of the best friends of the Council, member of our Board of Trustees since its founding, chairman of our original nominating committee, therefore the equivalent of the first chairman of the Council, a former ambassador to Trinidad and Tobago, Ambassador J. Fife Simon. It's an enormous pleasure to introduce the ambassador. Mr. Simon.
Thank you very much, Frank. We're a very lucky group tonight, I think, yes. There is a gross, I think, and I'm not trying to pick out individuals or any segment of the population, but there's a gross ignorance on the part of the American public. I'm sure has scattered its ignorance around Baltimore and Maryland with respect to Central America and the Caribbean. And very personally, I'm thrilled that we're fortunate enough to have Ambassador Charles Gillespie here tonight to educate us, and that includes me because I need it badly, and I'm really looking forward to what he's going to say to you tonight. I don't want to waste his precious moments by going into a long dissertation about his record in the State Department. As you know, he's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Caribbean and Central American Affairs, which has become, over the last 10 years, one of the key and one of the most influential positions that we have in the State Department. Just as it is beginning to sink in on the American public that we have a group of possibly so-called republics to the south of us who are vital not only in our newspapers, but they are vital to our future and our relationship with them. And fortunately, Ambassador Gillespie has had experience in Central America, in Managua, and in Mexico City with the department. Has had many other responsible positions, culminating recently in taking charge in Grenada after we took the island over. So it is with real pleasure that I introduce the ambassador, and I know that he's going to give us a very good expose and bring us up to date on where we stand down there at the present time. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Well, if there's anything I've learned in the 3 years in which I've been dealing in policy toward the Caribbean Basin, as we define it, it's that it often takes some kind of dramatic event to capture people's attention. And I don't know that people are ignorant of Central America, or people don't really know where it is or what the Caribbean is. They may be confused sometimes by how we define it, or it gets defined by those who are trying to deal with its affairs. But I think that I'd like to to relate about 3 dramatic events from the recent past and show you that we do have a coherent approach to what I would rather call the Basin than I would rather call something like Caribbean and Central America. The first dramatic event was one that did indeed touch me personally, and it happened on October the 24th when I was in Bridgetown, Barbados, having been there for about a week. And that was when I received a call saying that the president had named me ambassador and wanted me to be his representative on the island of Grenada, which the following day was going to be visited by the troops of the 82nd Airborne. And that call was a surprise. By that point, the action itself, the rescue operation, was not, but the call certainly was. One gets selected in interesting ways for jobs in the U.S. Foreign Service. From that personal standpoint, let me say that we moved into Grenada not as part of a strategy, not as part of a policy, but in response to a very specific situation, which involved basically a revolution run amok. That revolution went off the tracks somewhere, if it ever was really on the tracks, and it resulted in the murder out and out of its leader, Morris Bishop, members of his cabinet, friends of his, and a number of innocent Grenadians. The number at this point is still not known for sure how many. There were 3 reasons why we did what we did on October 25th. They run a bit in parallel. The first reason was that U.S. citizens were in danger. I had gone to Bridgetown the preceding week on a long scheduled visit. I was going to go meet the prime ministers of the Eastern Caribbean, that's basically the English Commonwealth Caribbean, and talk to them about developments on Grenada to find out what their views were, so that I would be able better in Washington, and particularly in dealing with the Congress, to explain why our views toward that country and its government were what they were. Well, I arrived in Bridgetown on the evening of the 19th, was met at the airport by the number 2 man at the American Embassy in Bridgetown, who told me that Morris Bishop, there was a report, not yet confirmed, that Morris Bishop had been either executed or assassinated, and that things were very, very rough on the island. I began to realize my plans were going to change. Indeed, they did. I was asked by Washington to stay in Bridgetown and to do a couple of things. We have an embassy there. We have an ambassador, at the time, a very competent ambassador. I was asked to stay there and to assist him in anything that seemed to need doing. And that first night, we really didn't know what did need doing. But it became clear within a short period of time that Americans on the island, and we weren't exactly sure how many there were. Ours is not a perfect world, particularly where it comes to statistics. So we were aware that Americans on the island were calling their homes in the States. They were calling Bridgetown and saying they were afraid of what was going on, because that night, someone who called himself the head of something called the Revolutionary Military Council had announced that there was a 24-hour shoot-on-sight curfew that was in effect. And on an island of 87,000, which is roughly 10 by 13 miles, when reports are running rampant that up to 200 citizens have been brutally machine-gunned in the capital city, those reports were believed at the time. There was no doubt in many minds that that shoot-on-sight curfew was for real. A lot of young Americans who were studying at the St. George's University School of Medicine believed they were in danger. A lot of Americans who were on the island, either in retirement, not many in business, it hasn't been that kind of an island, but who are resident there, either in retirement or on vacation, were concerned. A lot of British citizens, Canadians, and just a lot of Grenadians were scared to death. Well, I was asked to take over the job of trying to monitor the safety of the Americans. The ambassador had his hands full because the 20th and the hours started on the 21st, it became apparent that governmental leaders throughout the area were using their own sources of information in their mini and those small islands in what is really culturally, socially a pretty homogeneous mix. We're finding out that things on the island were very bad, that this Revolutionary Military Council might have some sorts of crazy ideas about reaching out, doing things. Certainly it was a rogue group. And those governmental leaders were very much concerned about what was going on, and they saw developments there clearly threatening them, their own countries and their societies and peace in the region. And they were talking to us through the chairman of a group called the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, consisting of basically 6 of the English-speaking Eastern Caribbean countries, about doing something to set the situation straight. So our ambassador had the job of dealing with their representative, who at the time was the Prime Minister of Dominica, Eugenia Charles, a lady of the region who's a lawyer, a very strong personality, a very strong political leader, a true Democrat. And she, representing that group, was already in close talk with Tom Adams, who's the Prime Minister of Barbados, and with Eddie Seaga, who's the Prime Minister in Jamaica, about the possible need to take some kind of action to set the situation on the island straight. And there is a provision in the charter of the organization of which talks of mutual security and, in effect, a police type of action. And they were thinking of invoking that. Later on, a third line of action developed, which the ambassador and I got involved in. And that was when, as we were learning, the sole remaining constitutional authority on Grenada requested help from abroad, specifically mentioning the OECS countries, ourselves, the United Kingdom, and Jamaica and Barbados. The Governor General of Grenada, as the sole constitutional authority remaining as far as any of our lawyers could determine, and British lawyers as well, made a plea for help. Said the situation has reached the point of no return, and if something isn't done right away, I fear the lives of more innocent people will be taken, and we need help, and I would like to ask you to intervene. That situation was going on at the same time. But from my own personal standpoint, the driving situation involved, as we later, within the next few days, began to piece the information together, involved 600, 700, maybe 800 or 900 American citizens who were on Grenada, trying to take care of themselves and who were scared to death. And I became scared for them as the information came in. We started to talk to the Revolutionary Military Council. I sent officers to Grenada. They had a dickens of a time getting in. They were fired at from the ground. Their plane was waved off once. They had to go to another island and wait to be permitted in. Once they got in, they began their talks. And to compress and abbreviate the thing, within a couple of days, we learned that the people who were in charge might or might not really be in charge, but they had guns and they had ammunition, and they were clearly not ready to allow us peacefully to help those Americans who wanted to leave get off the island. On Saturday, the 22nd, about 60 Americans were able, by getting on boats, to go to another island nearby. What they reported was quite scary. And on Sunday, I concluded that we could easily face a situation not at all unlike the thing that happened in Tehran several years ago, and that we might find Americans indeed hostage on the island. So our recommendations were very, very strong to Washington. We felt that a rescue operation for Americans was necessary. We had talked to the Revolutionary Council, had even gone to the Cunard line and had asked if we could have the Cunard Countess, which is their local love boat, and big white, pretty ship, which and they were willing to unload that thing in Bridgetown or another nearby island, get all the cruise passengers off, and send that ship into St. George's Harbor and let us use it for the peaceful, quiet, we would hope permitted departure of as many Americans who wanted to go. And again, by Saturday and Sunday, that number was growing. We had people on the island who were talking to them, registering them, getting their names, their home addresses here in the States, and asking them specifically what they wanted to do. The number just kept going up and up. But we couldn't convince the Grenadians who had the guns that they should allow that to happen. And so we concluded that we'd better act. In the space of roughly 17 hours, the 82nd Airborne and Ranger groups from Fort Lewis, Washington were put on planes, and the first parachutists dropped on Point Salinas Airport on the south end of the island. Immediately met resistance from Cubans there and Grenadian People's Revolutionary Army members. Basically what happened was that within, roughly 48 hours, about 8,000 American troops were on Grenada. Within 45 days, the 8,000 troops were off. They left behind some diplomats, me, and a handful of people, maybe 25, about 225 military policemen and women, and some medical personnel, communications personnel, some helicopter pilots and crews with medevac helicopters, what is basically a support element for the group that really is assisting the interim government of Grenada, which functions and functions well, with maintaining law and order on the island now, called the Caribbean Peace Force. It consists of policemen, for the most part, from the various islands of the region. They are maintaining what has become a very stable situation. The interim government, which was named by the Governor General and within his constitutional authority, which advises him, but really which makes basic governmental decisions, has developed an investment code, is reforming some of the tax laws, has carried out a number of standard governmental actions, and which will sit until there are, to use the Governor General's words, free, fair, and open elections on that island before the year is out. That government is being supported by the Caribbean Peace Force, which we in turn are supporting. We have an aid mission there. We found that Russians in large numbers for that island, some 49 of them were there. There were 16 East Germans and North Koreans, about the same number, a large Cuban mission, as one might expect, having read about what happened there. And there was obviously a large flow of assistance of various kinds to the government of Grenada, and that has to be replaced. So we, and the British, and the Canadians, and the West Germans, and the Common Market, and other countries of the region, with Venezuelan help, with some help from the Dominican Republic, believe it or not, and a variety of others, are trying to help Grenadians now put things back together after what turns out to have been 4.5 years of a steady downhill slide of a society. We think the elections will take place. We expect them to be in October or November. There is a political spectrum that ranges from traditional right to far left. Grenada's constitution permits of no barring on the basis of race, creed, color, political philosophy, or ideology. A Communist Party can exist on the island and can stand in elections if it chooses. What we're seeing is the development of a political spectrum which is fairly broad, and this week they completed the process of registering voters for the first time since about 1975. And it was truly gratifying for the Governor General, who sent me a message that the registration was complete, and out of maybe as many as they had thought, 48,000 potential voters, 47,000 had registered. They were pleased. It's not compulsory, it's not mandatory, it's completely free participation in that process. So the island is stable, but it's changed. It's changed from what it was. And the situation in the Eastern Caribbean has changed, and changed dramatically. The security situation in that end of the Caribbean basin has gone from one where there was indeed, and we now know the dimensions of this, there was indeed a large armed force supplied by the Soviet Union, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, Libya, with weapons of destruction of all kinds, some very modern and some very old, which in the eyes of most of the leaders of the region, many of the people of the region, really served as a base for either subversion or eventual movement to encroach, shifted from that, where that kind of threat existed, to one where basically the threats are much smaller now. They're much more manageable. They're much more easily dealt with. And prior to October, this government, ours, this administration, had a strategy which is the same strategy that applies throughout the basin of supporting democratic institutions, their development, their growth, supporting economic development, and supporting an approach to security issues, to military problems, which is commensurate with the threat and which we hope is sufficient to guarantee enough security and enough stability so that the prior two strategies can work, that is the development and growth of democracy and democratic institutions, and economic development can happen. So in line with that policy, prior to October, we were supporting the countries in the region as they considered how they would deal with a threat which at the time was believed to involve about 2,000 to 5,000 Grenadian army people, with an airport on the island which, while no matter what it might have been designed for, was fully capable of supporting the largest jet aircraft that anybody can imagine flying in this hemisphere, and which could be used as a transshipment point for a variety of things. And we've now shifted within that same strategic mix to continue our emphasis of supporting Grenada and the rest of the Eastern Caribbean in the redevelopment, the rebirth, if you will, the revitalization of democratic institutions. We're trying to assist as we can with the economic development of the island, as we have been with the economic development of other islands in the region. And our view toward security now is one where we are consulting with and counseling the governments of the region to think about how they will deal with today's threats, which probably consist, by and large, of some risk that groups of maybe as many as 40, 50, 100, if they're that large, would try somehow to knock off a government on one of those islands, as they tried in 1979 to do in St. Lucia, and they tried to do at other times in Dominica. And because we try to watch such things, as do the governments in the region, there is still talk today among some of the really radical revolutionary elements that they're going to try to do on other islands. Well, that's a far cry from what might have been talked about before, and we hope that those governments will be able to come to the right conclusions, and we see the possibility, essentially in the eastern end of the Caribbean, eastern end of the basin, for very stable, very peaceful, and we hope not heavily armed societies to to continue to exist and indeed to prosper, and turn their energies to what is really important, which is the development of that area. Just for a second, think of 10 to 15 small islands out here with at the most 250,000 on the largest, and many with as few as 10,000, trying to exist as independent states and economies with all the trappings that go with it at the end of very, very long sea lines of communication, and most of them without any airports at all. And they've got problems of growing population. They have problems of democratic institutions which are of long standing, but which are not perfect by any means. Some of the people there have tried to analyze those institutions and see what their problems are. There may be problems of scale, of size. When you have a parliament of 9, it's a little hard to figure out exactly how they're going to get a real mix of ideas on dealing with problems. So we see the change situation in the Eastern Caribbean. We think the dramatic events of October and what's followed have marked a real change. And basically, we think here in the United States and in much of the world, people now understand a little bit more about that place, that part of the world. They understand a little bit more about why it might be important to us and to them. And we see very positive prospects for the future. The second dramatic event that I want to touch on is all the way at the other end. It's in a country which doesn't even have a Caribbean shore, and yet we consider it to be in the Caribbean Basin. That's El Salvador. And the dramatic event is not necessarily the election of Jose Napoleon Duarte as president of El Salvador, but it's the fact that a president has been elected. That in March of 1982, a constituent assembly was elected with the announced goal of having elections within 2 years so that a president could be elected, and with the still outstanding objective of elections in March 1985 for a legislature and for municipal governments. We are extremely encouraged, we're pleased, and I think Democrats, small d, throughout the world are indeed pleased by what has happened in El Salvador. President Duarte was inaugurated last Friday, June 1st. Present at his inauguration was the Mexican Secretary of Foreign Relations, Bernardo Sepulveda. That's the first time a senior Mexican official has been in El Salvador for more than 6 or 7 years. Members of the Socialist International and other European political groups were present at that inauguration. And they congratulated Duarte, and really they celebrated Salvador's demonstration of true democratic performance. Now, we think that that's very clearly within the strategy that we see as being important for the basin as a whole. We're delighted by what's happened. We were pleased at the election, that it happened, that observers reported that it was fair, it was open, it was free. We were delighted to see that an inauguration happened, that the event occurred. Salvador is a country with a long history of violence, toughness, and roughness, and we continue to be hopeful, and we continue to support now President Duarte as he tries to move that country and move a government forward in the areas of further democratization, economic development, because the guerrillas of the left have just made a shambles of that economy, and as he attempts to deal with what is a very active, very virulent insurgency within his own country. Someone was asking me earlier if we had to persuade Duarte to take steps to preserve human rights, to deal with the left in an open, direct way, and to deal with the right to try to control its excesses. And my answer was, we don't have to convince Duarte of anything. For 20 years, that man has been a staunch Democrat, and more important, a staunch Salvadoran who believes that the future of his country does indeed lie in following a democratic path and giving his people the chance to realize their basic needs. He's also a realist. He knows that his problems come from the right as well as from the left, but that the problems on the left are bigger in number, that they need careful attention. And so he has asked us to continue military assistance. He wants our help with economic assistance, and we will try to give it to him to the extent that we're able to. The drama of his election, of the election, his victory, and his inauguration is that we sense, at least in the Congress, at least in Washington, the development of a consensus, which is basically that Duarte and that elected president and the government that he forms deserves our help, and we think the votes on foreign assistance legislation a couple of weeks ago in the Congress reflect that consensus, and we know that our contacts with members of Congress from both parties and really from the broadest spread of political ideology continue to reflect that consensus. And we encourage Duarte in his actions, which we hope will hold things together. The third dramatic event was one which, in Washington, at least in the Post, almost overshadowed Duarte's own inauguration, or reports of that inauguration. Because on the way home, Secretary of State Schultz stopped in Managua for the first meeting between a senior administration official, a Secretary of State of this government, and the leadership in Nicaragua since 1981. And this move shocked many. It shocked many in this country, again, from both sides of our own political spectrum. It shocked people around the world, really, who have been focusing on the problems of Central America, because I think there was a strong belief that had been fed not by anything we intended to do or that we feel we did, but had been fed by those who said, well, the United States talks about dialogue but never does it. We feel we have dialogue with a lot of people ourselves, and we've promoted it. The President has named 2 special envoys for Central America, and we think that they have carried out dialogue with Nicaraguans, with others in the region. The action that Secretary of State Schultz took was calculated to do 2 things. It was to let the Nicaraguans know very directly and up front exactly what our objectives are vis-a-vis Nicaragua. And second, to tell them we thought that we could achieve our objectives best in the context of the Latin American negotiations that are going on and are sort of carried under the rubric of the Contadora process. Contadora is the island off Panama, which gave its name to the group of Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and Panama, which is overseeing negotiations between the 5 Central American countries in an attempt to resolve the differences between and among those countries, which really do, in large measure, center on Nicaragua. And our objectives are embodied very clearly in the objectives of those Contadora negotiating groups. They have a list of 21 such objectives they've all agreed to. They've all agreed to try to achieve those objectives. Ours are there. Ours involve basically stop support for revolution in neighboring countries. They involve, for Nicaragua, the removal, the ending, the termination of Soviet bloc Cuban military direct involvement in Nicaragua. They involve a reduction in armies, armed force levels in that small Central American end of the basin to the point where they're more or less at least in sync with each other. Right now, Nicaragua has 100,000 men in an active army with T-54 tanks, with 122 millimeter howitzers, with RPG guided missiles, with anti-aircraft missiles, SAM-7 missiles. They have sophisticated electronics equipment which they've been provided, and at this juncture nobody in the region, even collectively, is a match for them. And believe me, people in that region are scared. Costa Rica, small country immediately to the south, never has had an army at all, and they're scared. Their president, Monge, a good member of the Socialist International, has come to us now on 3 different occasions saying, we've got to do something about this, we've got to have help, and he has indeed asked us to assist him in modernizing his very small police force, several thousand men who serve in rural spots, who have no training as military personnel at all, no military training, and he's making what is a basic shift, and it's just kind of the opposite of what we saw happen at the other end of the basin. It's people getting tougher. It's people having to go to more militarism. And I, for one, personally, as a citizen of this hemisphere, don't like that and don't want to see it happen, and would like to figure out how we can keep it from happening and move in that other direction, which the people in the East are now able to do. But Secretary Schultz wanted to outline for the Nicaraguans the fact that we wanted them to cut the links to the Soviets and the Cubans, stop the export of revolution, because that is an announced goal of their own Marxist-Leninist leadership, to reduce armed forces, and to support democratic pluralism in some way, as they promised to do in June 1979, as they were actually anticipating a taking of power from the Somoza regime, which had formerly ruled Nicaragua. They promised then that they would move immediately towards democratic pluralism and an open democratic society and elections. They haven't kept that promise. Now, we haven't defined how they have to do that, and I don't think we intend to define how they have to do it, but we know that there are plenty of examples around. They can definitely tell the Cubans and the Soviets that they don't need them anymore. They can do that if their neighbors will guarantee, under the broader Contadora umbrella, that they have no aggressive designs on the Nicaraguans. That's another good reason why they can reduce the size of their armed forces. We think that they can and they should tomorrow, in support for guerrilla groups next door in El Salvador and in Honduras, and we believe in Costa Rica. And we think that if they will allow an opening up of a process which they've already now announced, that is, suddenly, shortly after the operation on Grenada, the Sandinista government announced that there would be elections in Nicaragua on November the 4th, 1984. As of about 10 days ago, they had said that they would allow 3 days for voter registration in July. Somehow that doesn't quite square with what was a 12-week period of registration in Grenada, with a total population of about 87,000. Nicaragua has about 2.5 million people. 3 days doesn't seem like quite enough time to carry out an adequate voter registration. But in any event, if they will open up their process, if they will guarantee a free press, if they will guarantee security to those who want to participate in the process, then maybe that's enough. But in any event, Secretary Schultz laid those objectives out for the Nicaraguans, told the Nicaraguans that we, for our part, were prepared to discuss with them that agenda of ours, so that there be no misunderstanding about it. And on that basis, we were prepared to sit down and talk to them if they wanted to talk to us seriously, so that then within that larger Contadora negotiating process, things could proceed, there could be movement, there could be development. I might say that the stop itself, with all of its initial secrecy, was worked out with the Mexicans. President de la Madrid had been in Washington the 17th of May, and during that time had talked with President Reagan, and he and his foreign secretary had talked to us, and they had indicated that something was needed to move the Contadora process. And from those meetings, there emerged the idea that the Secretary of State would go to Nicaragua and that he would carry this out. Indeed, many of the arrangements were made with the assistance of the Mexican government, with Bernardo Sepulveda himself being directly involved. So, we think that that drama, the dramatic event of Grenada, the dramatic event of the Duarte election, and the dramatic event of the Secretary of State sort of dropping out of the sky into Nicaragua to talk to a Marxist-Leninist leadership about getting together and trying to solve problems, has caught attention. It's kept people interested, and it follows really what President Reagan has done now on a couple of occasions when he has gone to the American people on the issues of the Caribbean Basin and Central America. He made the dramatic move to open up our markets to this broad Caribbean Basin in an unprecedented way for 12 years. For the next 12 years, the countries that are designated as beneficiaries under the Caribbean Basin Recovery Act will have duty-free entry into our markets for their products as long as they meet a few basic conditions regarding where the stuff comes from and how much local value is added to it in the way of work or local content. We think that supports very strongly the idea of economic development. We think it's the kind of thing that can help these countries, and it can help businessmen, it can help governments plan, because it carries out over a period of some 12 years. Now, that was a dramatic announcement. The president, in April of 1983, went before the Congress, a joint session, and dramatically announced our policies for Central America, leaning very directly on the sort of the 4 points that I mentioned: of democracy and economic development, security, and dialogue among adversaries. And throughout, I think that the administration and those of us who've been working with Central America, with the Caribbean Basin, have been taking a few hits, some of them probably deserved, but not the one that hits hard, and that is that we don't understand what the root causes are for problems in any part of the basin. That we believe that military approaches are the only approaches, that we don't understand that there are deep social, economic inequities and differences. Well, I think I have to tell you, we do understand that. Part of our problem is that in our system, in our society, when you're trying to make your point, to gain support, to achieve specific objectives, you need to have something dramatic, and it's just not been very dramatic to have tough, careful discussions of social, economic problems that go back not just 10, 20, 30, 50, but literally hundreds of years to the discovery of this hemisphere and events even following that. So we find that an equally intrinsically dramatic event occurred, but really didn't get the kind of play, didn't get the kind of reaction that these others did, when the president formed a bipartisan commission under Henry Kissinger, which made an exhaustive study of problems in the region, turned in a report in January, and when in February the president submitted what is basically now called the Jackson Plan for 1984, which is named for Scoop Jackson, who was really one of those who had come up with the concept of trying to address the root causes of problems in this hemisphere, and specifically in that part of the basin called Central America, where they're longest and where they're deepest. That, in a nutshell, is $8 billion. $8 billion over 5 years, which is peanuts compared to what we spend in many parts of the world, and obviously it's certainly peanuts compared to what we spend for defense in any given year. It's addressing balance of payment support, it's food assistance, it's housing, it's education, including scholarships and technical assistance to educators, it's agriculture, It's something called the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a non-governmental organization which exists and which really combines Republicans, Democrats, the Chamber of Commerce, the AFL-CIO, in a concerted effort to advance the cause of democracy throughout the world, not just in this hemisphere, certainly not just in the Caribbean Basin. And none of that works if you don't have citizens who are reasonably confident that the whole thing is going to work. So we're pursuing those lines directly. For this year and in each of those 5 years that I mentioned, we're going to be dealing with assistance which is essentially 3/4 economic, 1/4 military, and we hope that military number can go down. That's definitely our goal. We want to see it happen. So, the President's strategy is one which tries to integrate each of these approaches that I mentioned. It's one that we think we can work. The processes are complex, the situations are very complicated, but we believe that following that strategy without regard to whether the people are English-speaking at one end or Spanish-speaking at the other, or French-speaking or Dutch-speaking or Portuguese or otherwise speaking, is what will work and which has the best chance for peace in the Caribbean Basin. Thank you.
Well, we certainly thank you very much for that comprehensive view of the area. It's a fine introduction to our Q&A period. You know our ground rules. We'll finish promptly at 10 minutes after 7. If you do have to leave early, we'd rather that you either sat on the far side by the window or left now, or otherwise leave at the same time as the ambassador does.
I'll jump out.
Yes, first question, Mr. Blumberg.
You have former one Secretary of State now, has he also suggested to them what they could do if they did not get rid of the Cuban? So, in other words, were we this Secretary of State, we will continue on so far. That's the big argument.
I think the Secretary of State made very, very clear to Comandante Daniel Ortega what our objectives were and what we want to see in the region, which is a peaceful, stable, developing set of societies, countries at peace with each other. I don't know that he threatened. In fact, I'm sure he did not threaten them in any way. His was a mission of looking for positive outcomes and not a mission looking for ultimatums.
Ambassador Simonton, you have a question.
Mr. Ambassador, would you be kind enough to give us your insight into the two wholly different cultural, economic, and military aspects of the English-educated Caribbean states and the Spanish psyche, inheritance from the early settlements in Central America? And how does the State Department look on the overall Caribbean picture, and how do we intend to handle in the future the two essentially different populations of the Eastern Caribbean and the Central American republics?
Where's my blue book? Mr. Ambassador, you've given me a lot of room, which is what everyone likes to have. We don't try to make a direct distinction between the linguistic and the cultural groups. We do try to think of what is to our south as important to us. I'd be kidding all of you and myself if I tried to say that we've dealt with our hemisphere in any terribly consistent way over time, except to say maybe cyclically. But nonetheless, we see the Caribbean Basin as being very, very close to our shores and much closer today than it used to be. We see in the Eastern Caribbean, which is essentially Eastern English speaking, that the people have stopped looking east to England and to their old metropolitan countries, and they look north to us. They're looking at us as being important to them. There's been a lot of movement of their populations to the north. There are probably more Grenadians in Toronto and Queens combined than there are in Grenada proper. And so we see that happening. We see that Venezuela to the south, a Spanish-speaking country, has, in recent months, we think because a new government has taken office and because of the events in the Eastern Caribbean of October and following, they've named a new team to look into Venezuelan interests throughout the Caribbean, English-speaking, Spanish-speaking, and otherwise, because they see that as an area of interest to them, and they want to cooperate with us and work with us on addressing some of the real long-term problems that are essentially economic in the region. We see the Dominican Republic, which is the largest island democracy around, with about 6 million people who are under a democratic government, has had changes of powers, taking the same view. Their selection of a special ambassador to the Eastern Caribbean by President Jorge Blanco, we think, is a signal event. It's very important. They don't just look east, they all look west to the Central American Isthmus, and what's become important to all of us, and I think it's happening here in the United States as well, is a lot of these linguistic differences and the cultural differences are becoming slightly less important, maybe a little more submerged or merged. And what we're really looking at are what are the conditions in the region, what are the U.S. interests in the region, and in a practical, hard-headed sense, how do we work both to protect our interests and to the degree that they are synonymous, and in many cases they're so close that it squeaks, how do we help them advance their interests so that their people can move forward and we move forward at the same time. I know that doesn't really get into the historical part of it, but I hope that'll.
Mr. Parr.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Secretary. On behalf of the Park Bench Society of the Utah State, I'd like to thank you for your remarks on President Reagan's Caribbean Initiative program. What I'd like to know is if you could give us a status report on its effectiveness so far.
Well, it's not something at this point that you can put a statistical measure on, but I can describe a lot of activities. I can describe a lot of developments that we think probably wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for that Caribbean Basin Initiative. Manufacturing and industrial associations are being formed on the islands of the Caribbean and in the countries of Central America in an attempt to attract investment. We see not only American businessmen, but businessmen from Taiwan, from Korea, and from Hong Kong, moving quickly into the Caribbean and from Japan to see if there isn't some way that by establishing facilities in the Caribbean Basin, they can have a better penetration of U.S. markets. Again, with the kinds of protections that are in the Caribbean Basin Recovery Act, we're confident that that doesn't hold out any threat to our own economy. In fact, we see it as a boom. We see investment actually happening. It's happening in Jamaica, it's happening in Barbados, it's happening on Grenada. And we think that that is in large measure happening as decision makers, businessmen and women, see that there is the prospect for something good happening if they make those moves, if they make those steps. I suspect it'll be because those decisions are not made overnight, and the bill was really only signed into law early last fall, into the summer, that we won't be able to statistically measure how much investment has occurred or precisely where it is as a result of that for a while longer. But the signs we see are positive, and the inquiries that we in the State Department, people in the Commerce Department, the Special Trade Representative, and others get are really fantastic in number, tens of thousands of inquiries every week.
Yes, sir.
The ambassador has partially answered my question. I won't pursue it anymore, but I would like to suggest that he come back next year and give us an up-to-date report on these conditions that he says the administration has put into effect.
Well, he's always welcome, of course.
Let me just say that that I've now been in this job effectively for 3 years, and at the conclusion at each anniversary, I feel a little better about what I see. So that's my measure of progress, and I'm still willing to stay in it.
Yes, sir.
Oh, and actually, Gillespie, question related to your first major the British reaction to U.S. activity on Grenada was initially very critical. That's particularly surprising given Martin Thatcher's overall political philosophy. I wonder if you could comment on their initial reaction and then their subsequent reaction after the case.
Well, you've accurately described the initial reaction. It was indeed critical, and I wouldn't want to try to hazard a guess as to why it was critical. I don't think that would be appropriate. I can say that Prime Minister Adams of Barbados has stated that he passed on the invitation to Britain to involve itself in the rescue operation, and basically got no response. We don't know if that was a matter of timing or what. What's really much more important is that since October, in fact, on November the 25th, the House of Commons voted to reestablish a bilateral aid relationship, assistance relationship with Grenada, voted £2 million for that purpose. The British are the principal trainers and developers of a new Grenadian police force. They're assisting with power generation on the island. They're putting a whole lot of work, an awful lot of energy, and real resources into Grenada's redevelopment and growth. Now I'll speculate a little bit. I'm not sure that since really Britain began to cut its ties in the mid-70s, or the ties with Britain were being cut from the Eastern Caribbean in the mid-70s, if there hadn't been some sort of drift, which does occur from time to time, and the events of October caused Britons to look at those relationships, to see what was happening, and to realize that there still were, despite the shift in focus or view from east to north, there still were very, very close ties with those countries and with those cultures, and that maybe, indeed, Britain ought to get back into the act. That's what they're doing. We're glad to cooperate with them, and we think it's something that we all have a direct interest in.
Yes, sir.
Sir, I'm from the Communist Workers' Party, not a member of the group, but I would like to ask you about not just the invasion of Grenada, but why has the policy of the United States been one of repeated invasions of Central America, including other invasions of Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and why is the United States pursuing a policy of provoking war with Nicaragua, and why should the American people support this policy and a government that consciously, deliberately pursues provoking war with another country?
Well, I guess our optics are a little bit different. We don't see ourselves as provoking war. We don't believe we have been provoking war. I was in Nicaragua when the Somoza government was in its final days. I saw strong Democrats, not of Somoza's persuasion or allied with him, who joined with the Frente Sandinista to carry out what they thought was going to be a peaceful, democratic growth period after the awful carnage and the violence of 1970, late 1978 and 1979. Those Democrats saw their revolution stolen by people who call themselves today and did then Marxist-Leninists. They've seen the economy basically ruined. They've seen that country turn directly, despite our efforts and our offers of assistance, military and otherwise, to that revolutionary government in 1979. We've seen them turn increasingly to the Soviet Union and Cuba, and we've seen those groups not hesitate to supply massive weapons of war and destruction, tanks, which had never been on the isthmus before, to that government. So I think I see the provocation coming from another angle.
Mr. Ambassador,
You said
We'll
that,
call on you in
we're
order,
for
please.
peace and economic development in the area.
Mr.
What I
Beck.
don't understand, then why are we supporting the Samostistas and mining the harbors of Nicaragua? Why we are supporting the Samostistas to bomb refineries? Why we are supporting the Samostistas through direct CIA aid, which is State Department policy, which is going to be voted on for $21 million in the next 2 days. If we're not provoking a war down there, what are we doing? Why are we negotiating with the Sandinistas? Why aren't we negotiating with the FMLN, FDR, and El Salvador? My question to you is, what is different about our behavior today than 1964, when the United States government led us into war in Vietnam? And as a survivor of that war, I refuse, and I know a lot of people in this room and in my generation refuse to get involved in another war in Central America.
If I may, before you answer the question, Mr. Ambassador, we try to follow an orderly pattern of calling upon people in the order that their hands are raised. And yours was actually the hand after the gentleman over there, and you would have been called on in your due time. So for those people who are guests of the council, I would appreciate if you would follow our normal procedures. Thank you very much.
I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion about Somocistas. That word is thrown around a lot. I don't think there has ever been anything that's a philosophy that Somoza propounded that was unique or different. I think that it's important to note that up until 1979, he had about, according to Dr. Jean Millett, who wrote The Guardians of the Dynasty, a definitive work on his Guardia Nacional. He had fewer than 7,000 men in that admittedly patriarchal army that he used to control the situation in his country. Less than 7,000, about 6,300 of them. He pressed people into service during the last days of his regime and eventually got the number up to somewhere around 10,000, we think. We're not sure. Today, 18,000 Nicaraguans who are not getting paid very much money, as far as anyone can tell, are willing to risk their lives to go back into Nicaragua to try to change what has happened there. Now, of the 6,300 members of the Guardia Nacional, over 4,000 stay in jail in Nicaragua. Now, I don't know where the other 16,000 came from, or whatever the number might be, but I would say that there is a group of people in Nicaragua tonight whom President Reagan has called freedom fighters. I don't think they're there for the money, and I'm not sure that they're there to get anything out of it. They certainly are in greater numbers than were in direct support of somebody called Somoza 5 years ago. And I think their ages are much younger than would admit that they were part of his organization. So I think that we see what's happening in Nicaragua, and I think that we don't like it. I think Nicaraguans don't like it. They'd like to change it.
Yes, sir.
I get confused. Dela Madrid came here, and according to the papers at least, I got the impression he was telling us, stop trying to solve the problems of Central America with armed forces. Not long after that, if the papers quoted him correctly, General Paul Gorman, who commands this whole area, made a statement which in effect said that the next major threat to the security of the United States will be subversive actions in Mexico, and you have to see drastic changes made in Mexico. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the CIA is going to go in and try to overthrow Dela Madrid to reestablish something? I don't know.
Well, I don't think that General Gorman had in mind those kinds of drastic changes. I think the situation in Mexico, as viewed by the Mexicans and in their own public statements, is one that has changed and one that they recognize is serious. They definitely have a view of how matters ought to develop in their immediate neighborhood. They have urged us not to rely on military force. We tell them we're not relying on military force. We see other means of accomplishing those objectives. It was Dela Madrid who, in effect, asked us to make the moves that were made last week. He consulted with us about them. We find ourselves in cooperation. As I said, we found the Mexican government making what we think is a major move by attending the Duarte inauguration. We find ourselves after the De La Madrid visit, and both immediately before and after Secretary Schultz's visit to Nicaragua, in much closer synchronization with the Mexicans than we have been for a long, long time.
Mr. O'Meara?
I have one question about Secretary Schultz's visit to Nicaragua. You mentioned the visit he went by to talk to Manuel Ortega and the other Sandinista leaders. And you said that what the United States wants Nicaragua to do is to stop subverting or helping the Salvadoran guerrilla. What you didn't mention, among other things that you didn't mention, but what you did mention is that Secretary of Schultz, among his list of conditions, was that they abolish their army or generally reduce it, and hold democratic elections, that sort of thing. Well, if you're under attack by a force that's sort of outside, how can you honestly go in and ask the government to reduce its army? And then on top of that, since when has the United States been interested in the democratic process in Nicaragua? We were never interested in it under Somoza. There are several other points that I think that ought to be made in the form of questions, because I don't want to make a speech. But one of them was the comment about President Montes in Costa Rica, how he's frightened of Nicaragua. It's my understanding he's frightened of us for the CIA attempts to drag Costa Rica into the war with Nicaragua. Now, I don't really think President Montes is frightened of Nicaragua. He just threw Eden Pastor out of the country. So, I'd like you to resolve those things.
Well, I can only tell you that it was President Monge who, in San Jose, worked out the Declaration of San Jose, which is the basis for our objectives in Nicaragua. It is President Monge and his government. It's the President Suazo of Honduras. It is the Salvadorans. It is all of those others who agreed formally, officially, in writing to the 21 Contadora objectives, among which are reduction of armed forces, the removal of outside military advisors, the cessation of support to revolution, and a strong endorsement of democratic processes and pluralism. Now, they're the ones who were engaged in negotiations with each other. We're not part of that negotiation. They're Latins, they're doing it in Spanish, they didn't want us in it, we haven't been in it, and they're the ones who made those objectives the key part of those negotiations and their search for peace. So I can only tell you that that is essentially their initiative, those are their...
You said that President Monge was afraid of the Nicaraguans. That's not what we're talking about. I don't see any sign of that.
Well, I think you have to listen, you have to read what President Monge and his government is saying, and I don't think that he would make a formal request to us for assistance of the kind that he's made if he didn't think he had a reason to do so. He's made that, he's stated that publicly, and I can only let the record speak for itself.
It's amazing how time goes by when it gets exciting. Unfortunately, we've approached 10 after. Mr. Ambassador, if I could impose on you for two people who have had their hands up a long time, and apologize to the rest of you. And of course, it's perfectly polite for you to leave at this time since it is 10 minutes after 7, but we will have two more questions. The gentleman on your right, Mr. Ambassador, and the gentleman here.
Mr. Ambassador, it seems to me that one is disposed to see what one wants to see, and when the mind is set to see what one wants to see. If the mind is set to see a Gulf of Tonkin incident, then one sees a Gulf of Tonkin incident. We've been told for 2 or so years that there is a great involvement of the Soviet Union via Cuba, via Nicaragua, spreading revolution in Central America and the growing crisis they're involved. And there's a mindset to see it. But I am impressed by the lack of evidence. And in the case of Grenada, the airport was given as the main evidence. Well, the airport, was it not
funded by our allies in Europe, and even a Florida contractor was involved? Was it not to promote the tourism because that economy needed it, and they didn't have an airport that could land large airliners for tourism? And in the case of El Salvador, if indeed Nicaragua, via Cuba, and Soviet Union, if indeed they are supporting the revolutionary movement by the guerrillas in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, I'm impressed by the lack of evidence in the last 2 years. If our mindset is that they are being supported from outside, where's the evidence?
I think the question is...
Yeah. The evidence was sufficient a year ago for the full House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in a democratically controlled House of Representatives with a clear Democratic majority to agree unanimously, without exception, that the evidence of support for revolution and the objective of spreading revolution from Nicaragua by Cuba with Soviet assistance was incontrovertible, their word. And I can't give you better public evidence than that, but to me, that's very, very strong. When all of the Democrats, as well as all of the Republicans, supported that kind of statement the way they did, they have made no change in their minds. If you talk to those members today, they will say that the evidence is as strong or stronger now.
Last question.
Mr. Ambassador, time goes fast when you're having fun, and I remember it was last summer or early fall, the Nicaraguans made a rather comprehensive offer to the United States as a start of as their offer as a start of discussions, bilateral discussions between the United States and Nicaragua. That was pretty much put under the rug in the State Department, as far as I can tell, by this administration. Could you make any comment about the difference between those offers at that time and Mr. Schultz's current office, other than perhaps the closer proximity to the general elections in the United States at this time?
Yeah, I think there is a misunderstanding of the offers that were made last summer. It has basically it's become, I must say, conventional wisdom that somehow those were comprehensive offers. Indeed, they were not comprehensive.
They offered to start discussions. They were basis.
They offered to start discussions. Nicaragua has offered to start discussions, but when visited by Assistant Secretary Enders in August of 1981, when asked to engage with the San Jose group in October of 1981, and in a series of meetings between Ambassador Stone and the Comandantes, Ambassador Schlaudeman and the Comandantes, and Ambassador Motley with the Comandantes, some of which were secret and which were never publicized, they did not seem to wish to pursue those discussions. They have shopped for forums whenever it seems to have suited their fancy or their particular tactics of the moment. They will go to the UN, much to the dismay of the Contadora group itself, which did not feel that they should move outside that basically Central American, Latin American, multilateral negotiating framework. And yet, without regard to that, when they felt it might be wise, they went to the UN, and they've gone to other fora as well. I think Secretary Schultz's visit, his talks with Ortega, and their agreement to continue talks now using Ambassador Schlaudeman and Victor Hugo Tinoco, the Deputy Foreign Minister, are something that we want to look on as encouraging. We want to look on that as a possibility, but I think that's all it is for now, and we're very hopeful that it will yield some results. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador. We certainly thank you very much for your sturdiness, for your spending your time, and so generously and directly